Welcome to our online study of the Gospel of Matthew. It's hoped that through these sessions, the Gospel readings of the A cycle of the Roman Catholic liturgy will become more understandable and appreciated. I project approximately 25 sessions, which will be posted at bi-weekly intervals throughout the coming year. In these first two sessions, I wish to present a number of themes which are characteristic of the Gospel of Matthew. But first, we should look at the basic introductory questions regarding Matthew. In particular, who was he, who did he write for, and where did he write? Then, we shall look into four particular themes treated in the Gospel. First, Jesus as the fulfillment of God's promise in the Old Testament. Then, Matthew as the ecclesial gospel, that is, Matthew's particular concern for the church in his gospel. This will be dealt with through an analysis in this session of two passages, the walking on water and the confession of Peter. Both of these highlight the role of Peter. A third passage, the church order discourse, will be discussed next time, along with the remaining themes. A common phrase that's used in the media and other 20th and 21st century outlets is "inquiring minds want to know." This can also be applied to the introductory questions of Matthew's Gospel. We want to know who Matthew is. However, Matthew and the editors of his Gospel were not that interested in the question, and so there's very little information in the Gospel to tell us about who Matthew is. Tradition from the time of the Fathers of the Church has identified Matthew as one of the 12 apostles, in particular the tax collector, whose name is also given as Levi, and who appears in Matthew 9:9. He also appears in Mark 3:18, Luke 6:15, and is mentioned in the list of the apostles found in Acts 1:13. The picture is a statue of Matthew, the tax collector, as is found among the statues of the 12 apostles in the Church of St. John Lateran in Rome. We see his tax rolls in his hand, and if you look carefully, you can see the coins for the tax at his feet. From the text of his Gospel, we discover that Matthew was well versed in Aramaic and Greek. This would be expected from an early Jewish Christian. However, he makes a number of blunders with regards to Hebrew, and it would appear that he was not that well versed in the finer points of the Hebrew language. This will be significant when we discuss the audience of Matthew's Gospel as primarily a Jewish Christian church. In Matthew 13:52, he speaks of a scribe trained for the kingdom of God. He describes this scribe as being like the master of a house, the oikodespotes, who brings out of his treasure what is new and what is old. In other words, he has the best of both worlds. He understands the world of Judaism and its religious practices and traditions, and at the same time he's a believer in Jesus Christ as the fulfillment of messianic expectation and as the Son of God. Thus, he writes a gospel for those who wish to embrace the message of Jesus, while at the same time not jettisoning everything of their previous religious experience in Judaism. Now, let's turn to the audience of Matthew's Gospel. Again, from a cursory look at the Gospel, it would appear that Matthew's writing his Gospel for educated Jews. They seem to be of the wealthier class. This can be concluded from a comparison with the Gospel of Luke, who would be written for a poorer audience. Matthew's monetary units are significantly larger than Luke's, and more telling is a comparison of the Beatitudes that appear both in Matthew and in Luke. In Luke, the first Beatitude is, "Blessed are you poor, for yours is the kingdom of heaven." In Matthew, this has been altered to, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." Why would it be necessary to alter "you poor" to "poor in spirit" unless the audience was not poor? It's clear that the recipients of Matthew's gospel are believers in Jesus, but they also are looking for a way to hold on to the traditions of Jewish law. Matthew shows that Jesus is not one who will abolish the Jewish law, but rather is one who will bring that law to its completion and perfection. He thus emphasizes and shows the continuity between Jesus and Judaism. The next introductory question is, where was this community located? Two locales surface: Galilee or Antioch in Syria. From Acts, we know that the church in Antioch was struggling with the very question of the relation of Judaism to Christianity, and many of the Christians in Galilee fled in the face of the Romans at the time of the revolt in 66 to 70. It would be more than likely that the gospel then was composed in the environs of Antioch, where those Christians fled to. The final introductory question is, when did Matthew write his gospel? Given the priority of Mark's gospel, as we argued at the opening of the series on Mark, and a corresponding date for Mark in the middle of the 70s, it would be necessary then for Mark's gospel to circulate and Matthew to gain familiarity with it, since it generally is considered as a source for Matthew. Thus, the earliest dates for Matthew composing his gospel would be the late 70s of the first century. But more than likely it was in the mid-80s or the early 80s. So, having resolved the questions of inquiring minds, let us now turn to the key themes of Matthew's gospel. The first theme follows directly upon the fact that Matthew in his gospel tries to show continuity between Christianity and Judaism. Throughout the gospel, Matthew tries to show Jesus and the church as a fulfillment of Old Testament promises. What we see in the gospel was foretold in the Hebrew Scriptures. More than any other evangelist, Matthew uses the Old Testament, not only in allusion, but also in direct citation. In particular, Matthew employs what have come to be known as formula citations. The name derives from the fact that these citations of the Old Testament are introduced with a particular formula, which is, "This occurred in order to fulfill the word of the prophet." This formula, or one similar to it, appears some 12 times in the course of the Gospel of Matthew. Sometimes he names the prophet, sometimes he doesn't, and sometimes he gives the name of the wrong prophet. Thus, through this formula, Matthew intends to show that many of the key events in the life and ministry of Jesus have direct relationship to prophecies made by the prophets of the Hebrew Bible. Through these citations, Matthew seeks to show that Jesus and his ministry is in continuity with the Hebrew Bible and with developing Judaism. In each of these citations, Matthew and his community, reflecting on the events of Jesus' life, see a deeper sense in the words of the prophets, which was not intended by the prophet at all. This deeper sense is known in biblical jargon as the sensus plenior. The first 4 of these citations are found in the opening chapters of the Gospel, which have come to be known as the infancy narrative. The first of these citations is located at the end of the first chapter of Matthew's Gospel, at chapter 1, verse 22. It occurs in the narrative of the announcement of Jesus' birth to Joseph. In the course of that announcement, Matthew comments, "All this took place to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet." Then Matthew cites Isaiah 7:14. "Behold, the virgin will conceive and bear a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel." I'll simply list the formula citations here. As we go through the Gospel, we'll show how Matthew in his reflection develops a deeper meaning, a fuller meaning, a sensus plenior for these Old Testament prophecies. The second formula citation is in Matthew 2:15, where he cites Hosea 11:1. "Out of Egypt I have called my son," in connection with the flight into Egypt. The third is Matthew 2:17, where he cites Jeremiah 31:15. "A voice was heard in Ramah, weeping and loud lamentation, Rachel weeping for her children." This text is cited in connection with the massacre of the innocents. The final text formula citation in the infancy narrative is found in Matthew 2:23, where a theme from a number of prophets is cited. "He shall be called a Nazarene." This is cited in connection with the settling of the Holy Family in Nazareth. Moving outside of the infancy narrative, the fifth formula citation is found in Matthew 4:14. It cites Isaiah 8:23 to 9:1. "The land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, the way of the sea, beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles. The people dwelling in darkness have seen a great light. For those dwelling in the region and shadow of death, on them a light has dawned." This text is cited in connection with the early preaching of Jesus in the area of Galilee, and in particular with Jesus taking up residence in Capernaum. The next formula citation occurs at Matthew 8:17, where Isaiah 53:4 is cited in connection with Jesus' cures. Isaiah had said, "He took our illnesses and bore our diseases." The next citation is at Matthew 12:17, where Isaiah 42:1-4 is cited introducing Jesus as the servant of the Lord, of 2nd Isaiah, who has been chosen and with whom God is well pleased. This citation and the preceding are from the servant canticles of Isaiah. The latter citation is given in connection with the cure of the man with the withered hand. The next citation occurs in Matthew 13:14, where Isaiah 6:9 is cited in connection with the reason for Jesus speaking in parables. This is one of the citations that Matthew shares with Mark and Luke, although Mark and Luke cite the text with different variations. There is yet another formula citation in chapter 13, at chapter 13, verse 35, again in connection with the parables, where Matthew cites Psalm 78:2, "I will open my mouth in parables, and I will utter what has been hidden since the foundation of the world." Interestingly, the formula says that this was to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet unnamed, yet Psalms is cited. Next, we find a citation of Zechariah 9:9 at Matthew 21:4 in connection with the entrance of Jesus into the city of Jerusalem. All four evangelists use some form of Zechariah 9:9 in their narratives of that entry. "Say to the daughter of Zion," Zechariah says, "Behold, your king is coming to you, humble and mounted on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a beast of burden." The final formula citation in the Gospel is found in the Passion narrative at Matthew 27:9, where Zechariah 11:13 is cited in connection with the death of Judas. Matthew attributes the citation to Jeremiah, but the major portion of it is from Zechariah. Again, quoting Zechariah, "Then the Lord said to me, throw it into the treasury, the handsome price at which they valued me. So I took the 30 pieces of silver and threw them into the treasure of the house of the Lord." A second major theme of Matthew's Gospel is his concern for the church. Matthew has been called by many the ecclesiastical gospel. One could say that Matthew's Gospel is a handbook for life in the church, and in particular for future leadership in the church. In fact, about 60 to 70 years after Matthew's Gospel was written, the first formal handbook of conduct in the church appeared, known as the Didache, or the teaching of the 12 apostles. This handbook was heavily dependent on the Gospel of Matthew. Matthew is the only one of the 4 Gospels to use the specific word church, ekklesia in Greek, in his text. He uses the word twice. At Matthew 16, "You are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church," and again at Matthew 18:17. "If he refuses to listen, tell it to the church." The word ekklesia is worth dwelling on for a few moments. As with many Greek words, it is compounded from 2 other Greek words, ek meaning from or out of, and kaleo meaning to call. Thus, the church is a community of those who have been called out of or called from their ordinary lives into the life that the church offers. This meaning of church is worth mulling over and meditating on. If church is significant to Matthew, so also is the leader of the church significant. As in Mark, Peter is for Matthew the first listed among the 12, and also the spokesperson for the 12. But in Matthew's Gospel, Peter is much more than that. Matthew shows the special position of Peter in his Gospel through the emendation, that is, alteration or revision, of 2 texts in Mark: the narrative of the walking on water and the narrative of Peter's confession. In each of these texts, Matthew adds a section specifically concerning Peter and his role in the church and his role among the other disciples. Let's take a closer look at each of these. The narrative of the walking on water is found at Matthew 14:22 to 33, which is parallel to Mark 6:45 to 52, which can be used to compare, especially with regard to the role of Peter. The locale of the narrative of the walking on water is the Sea of Galilee, which is a relatively small body of water, approximately 7 miles wide and 14 miles long, and shrinking ever more every year. Here we have a picture taken from a boat on the middle of the Sea of Galilee. As you can see, the shore is somewhat visible as the distance is not that great. Here are the remains of a 1st century fishing boat, which were found off the shore of the Sea of Galilee in an area known as Nof Ginesar. As you can see, the boat was relatively small and could be bashed easily by the winds and the waves on the sea. This is a picture of the same sea with a somewhat choppy waters. One can see how sailors, in a boat like the one we just saw, might be somewhat frightened as the winds and the waves became increasingly stronger during a storm. This is the setting for the narrative of the walking on water. The narrative begins following the Markan version of the narrative, up to the assurance of Jesus that the disciples not be afraid. It is he that is walking toward them. Then Matthew in his text departs from his source Mark, adding a section on Peter. Peter answers Jesus' statement that Jesus is the one with the address Kuria, Lord, which shows that he admits the possibility that it is Jesus whom they are seeing, but he wants further evidence. Thus he continues, if it is you, su'e, command me to come toward you on the water. Peter wants to do what God has done. One of the epithets of God in the Old Testament, particularly in the Psalms, is rider on the storm. Jesus rides the storm walking on the waters. Peter wants to be able to do the same. He knows that through the power of Jesus, wondrous things can be accomplished. The impossible becomes possible. Jesus responds to Peter with the simple command, come. He issues the invitation that Peter has requested. That invitation demands that Peter act. And so he gets out of the boat and he begins to approach Jesus walking on the water. And thus he comes to Jesus. But then Peter becomes aware of the surrounding situation, the storm and the winds. Peter takes his attention away from Jesus, who is his goal, and becomes aware of his own circumstances. This leads to fear. Ephobethe, he was afraid. And as a consequence, he begins to sink down. Katapontizastai. And thus Peter cries out again, addressing the Lord as Kuria, Lord, save me. This is very similar to the cry of the apostles to Jesus in an earlier passage on the storm at sea. In the midst of the storm, they cry out to Jesus, who was sleeping, to save them. Commentators note that Peter utters one cry, as there is only one source of salvation. As we touched on in the preceding paragraph, Peter's lack of faith is caused by a failure of concentration. He's distracted by the fierce wind. His mind became more affected by the circumstances than by faith in the power of Jesus. And once again, he became filled with fear. There's a lesson contained here for all of us. We must keep our gaze constantly on Jesus as our goal. When we take our eyes off of him, we begin to falter. We sink. We cry out in need of his saving hand. In response to Peter's cry, Jesus immediately extends his hand and takes hold of him, saying, O man of little faith, oligopista, pistis, faith, oligos, few, little. Peter's faith faltered. Hence he refers to him as oligopista, one who has small faith. That is then fleshed out in the next question. Why did you doubt? Distadzo, the word used here, is not the normal Greek word for doubt. It means rather to waver, to hesitate, to be uncertain, to be of divided mind. The image contained in the word is a person standing at the fork in a road and not knowing which way to choose. Peter, when he became aware of his situation as he was walking on water, was forced to choose between keeping his gaze on Jesus as one who could sustain him in this miraculous feat, or being concerned about the winds and the tossing waves about him, which could engulf him. Thus, this Matthean edition centers on Peter and his miraculous act of walking on water, but also on his lack of faith, which demanded that Jesus save him from the very waters that he walked on. The second text in Matthew that has an addition highlighting Peter is the confession of Peter. Again, Matthew follows the Markan text, noting the climactic confession of Peter, "You are the Christ." He then adds the epithet, "the Son of the living God." Not only is Jesus the expected one, the Messiah, but, as the Gospel will show, he is the Son of God. This fact Peter affirms in his confession in Matthew. The location of the confession of Peter is the region around Caesarea Philippi. This map shows the area as it was in the days of Jesus. Caesarea Philippi is located just south of Mount Hermon in the area of the Tetrarchy of Philip, outside the boundaries of Israel of the day. Caesarea Philippi is the area of Banyas, or Panium, where three rivers came together to form the Jordan River, which moves south from there. If we impose the current boundaries of today on the map, we see that Caesarea Philippi is located in the northern part of the region known as the Golan Heights, just south of the Syrian border. Currently, the Golan Heights is under the control of Israel, since they captured it in the 6 Days War. Prior to that, it had been held by Syria. The most prominent feature of the area around Caesarea Philippi are the rather large caves, which are the remnants of a temple to the Greek god Pan, which can be seen in this picture. It's from the god Pan that the area received the early name of Panias. Just in front of the temple flows the Jordan River, as can be seen in this picture. This is a close-up of the Jordan River as it passes the temple area in Caesarea Philippi. In the account of Peter's confession in the texts of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus asks his disciples who people think he is, and they answer with various expectations of the day. Then he asks who they think that he is. The response quickly comes from Peter. "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Peter's response in Matthew was slightly different from his response in Mark, as we saw. He adds the epithet, "the Son of the living God." This epithet will appear again in the Sanhedrin trial, where the high priest will append it to the title of Messiah or Christ. Adding the epithet, Peter in Matthew is saying that not only is Jesus the expected one, the Messiah, but he also is a divine being, the Son of God. This answer of Peter elicits a remarkable response from Jesus. He declares that Peter is Makarios, which is a Greek word meaning happy, fortunate, or blessed, that is, possessing the favor of God. In this declaration, Jesus uses Simon's formal name, Simon, son of Jonah, or son of John. Note, this declaration is to Simon Peter alone. Jesus continues that this conclusion is not the result of mere human calculation or reasoning. Flesh and blood did not reveal this to you. Rather, it's the result of divine revelation. But my Father, who is in heaven. Thus, the Father has revealed to Simon Peter the identity of the Son, Jesus. The verb apocalypto in Greek has the sense of expose or open to view, that which had been hitherto hidden. Jesus continues, "And I say to you, you are Peter, Petros, and upon this rock, epitaute te Petra, I will build my church, ecclesia. This is one of the most significant and at the same time debated verses in the Scriptures. The reason is that it provides a scriptural basis for the church as the community of the followers of Jesus on earth, and for the successors of Peter as the leaders of that community. The declaration of Jesus in the original Aramaic and in its Greek translation contains a play on the name of Peter, Petros, and the word rock, Petra. Peter is the rock upon which Jesus the Messiah will build his community, the church. Many on the basis of 1 Corinthians 3:11, which states that there is no other foundation for the church than Jesus Christ, will try to emphasize the demonstrative this as pointing to Jesus rather than Peter, to downplay the papacy. Jesus continues, "The gates of the underworld, Hadu or Hades, will not prevail against it." The question here is, what is the antecedent of it, Peter or the church? The gates of the underworld are akin to the gates of Sheol in the Old Testament. See Isaiah 38:10. Hagner sees the gates of being a symbol of the power of. Thus, the power of the underworld, Hades or Sheol, will not be in conflict with the church. Actually, they will be seen as an antithesis to the gates of heaven, to which Peter will be given the keys in the next verse. Although grammatically possible, Peter cannot be the antecedent of it here. As we well know, Peter does come under the power of death at the hands of Nero. It is thus grammatically and logically the church. Thus, Jesus announces that the church as God's end times community, and it will, despite all persecutions, not come to an end. Rather, it will survive to the end. Then, moving from the church to its leader, Peter, Jesus announces that he will give to Peter the keys of the kingdom of heaven, the kingdom opposed to the powers of the underworld. Keys have through the Old Testament been a symbol of authority, and thus a symbol of power over something. That power is then delineated in the following two statements. Whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven. Note the future tense here. And whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. From the rabbinic uses of bind and loose, we can surmise that this power has to do with determining what is permitted and what is forbidden in the context of the ecclesial community of the church. This is derived, as Hagner notes well, from the Matthean understanding that Jesus is the true interpreter of the Torah. Thus, his disciples will pass on that interpretation and extend it. Peter thus becomes the primary custodian and guarantor of the tradition and teaching of Jesus. In chapter 18, in the course of the church order discourse that we'll look at next time, in Matthew 18:18, this same power will be extended to the entire ecclesia. The text finishes with the charge of Jesus to the disciples to tell no one what has transpired, or that he was the Christ. Next time, we'll look at the church order discourse, and particularly the section on the church and the powers to bind and loose, as we see it in Matthew. Then we'll look at the theme of Matthew's movement from the Jewish out to the Gentile world, and finally conclude with the theme of Matthew's of doing over saying. See you next time.